How the economy works. How the economy machine works. In 30 minutes. The economy works like a simple machine, but many people don't understand it, or they don't agree on how it works. And this has led to a lot of needless economic suffering. I feel a deep sense of responsibility to share my simple but practical economic template. Though it's unconventional, it has helped me to anticipate and to set the stage for global financial crisis. And it's worked well for me for over 30 years. Let's begin. Though the economy might seem complex, it works in a simple mechanical way. It's made up of a few simple parts and a lot of simple transactions that are repeated over and over again trillion times. These transactions are above all else driven by human nature, and they created three main forces that drive the economy. Human nature, and they create three main forces that drive the economy. Number one, productivity growth. Number two, the short-term debt cycle. And number three, the long-term debt cycle. Well, look at these three forces and how laying them on top of each other create a good template for tracking economic movements and figuring out what's happening now. Let's start with the simplest part of the economy, transactions. An economy is simply the sum of the transactions that make it up, and a transaction is a very simple thing. And a transaction is a very simple thing. You make a transaction all the time. Every time you buy something, you create a transaction. Each transaction consists of a buyer exchanging money or credit with the seller for goods, services, or financial assets. Credit spent just like money. So adding together the money spent and the amount of credit spent, you could know the total spending. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it. That's a transaction. It's the building block of this economy machine. All cycle in all forces in an economy drive. All cycle in all forces in an economy are driven by transactions.
And that's it. The total amount of spending drives the economy. If you divide the amount spent by the quantity sold, you get the price. And that's it.
That's a transaction. It's the building block of the economy machine. All cycle in all forces in an economy are driven by transactions. So if we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of all the buyers and all the sellers making transactions for the same thing. For example, there is a wheat market, a car market, a stock market, and markets for millions of things. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its market. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. An economy consists of all of the transactions in all of its markets. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, that of everything you need to know to understand the economy.
Add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets.
That everything you need to know to understand the economy. If you add up the total spending and the total quantity sold in all of the markets, that of everything you need to know to understand the economy. It's just that simple. People, businesses, banks, and governments all engage in transactions the way I just described, exchanging money and credit for goods, services, and financial assets. The biggest buyer and seller is the government, which consists of two important parts. A central government that collects taxes and spends money, and a central bank, which is different from other buyers and sellers because it controls the amount of money and credit in the economy. It does this by influencing interest rates and printing new money. For these reasons, as wealthy, the central bank is an important player in the flow of credit. I want you to pay attention to credit. Credit is the most important part of the economy and probably the least understood. It's the most important part because it's the biggest and most volatile part. Just like buyers and sellers go to the market to make transactions, so do lenders and borrowers. Lenders usually want to make their money into more money, and borrowers usually want to buy something they can't afford, like a house or a car. Or they want to invest in something like starting a business. Credit can help both lenders and borrowers get what they want. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest.
Plus an additional amount called interest. Borrowers get what they want.
The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal. The borrowers promise to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest.
Additional help both lenders and borrowers get what they want.
The borrower promised to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. The borrowers promised to repay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. Called principal plus plus an additional amount called interest.
When interest rates, how the economic some of the we can understand transactions, we can understand the whole economy. A market consists of borrowers key because it has different names. As soon as credit is when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is settled. So why is credit so important? Because when a borrower is simple enough, but credit is, and lenders believe them, credit is created. Interest rates are low, plus an additional amount called interest, and borrowers get what they want.
Borrowers promise to pay the amount they borrow, called principal, plus an additional amount called interest. When interest rates are high, there is less borrowing because it's expensive. When interest rates are low, borrowing increases because it's cheaper. When borrowers promise to repay and lenders believe them, credit is created. Any two people can agree to create credit out of thin air. That seems simple enough, but credit is tricky because it has different names. As soon as credit is created, it immediately turns into debt. Debt is both an asset to the lender and a liability to the borrower. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is zero. In the future, when the borrower repays the loan plus interest, the asset and the liability disappear and the transaction is zero.
Action is settled.
Zero. So why is credit important? Because when a borrower receives credit, he is able to increase his spending. And remember, spending drives the economy. This is because one person's spending is another person's income. Think about it. Every dollar you spend, someone else earns, and every dollar you earn, someone else has spent. So when you spend more, someone else earns more. When someone's income rises, it makes lenders more willing to lend him money because now he's more worthy of credit. A credit-worthy borrower has two things: the ability to repay and collateral. Having a lot of income in relation to his debt gives him the ability to repay. In the event that he can't repay, he has a valuable asset to use as collateral that can be sold. This makes lenders feel comfortable lending him money. So increased income allows to increase the borrowing, which allows to increase the spending. And since one person's spending is another person's income, this leads to more increased borrowing and so on. But this reinforcing pattern is the economic growth and is why we have cycles. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something. And how much you get depends on how much. In a transaction, you have to give something in order to get something. And how much you get depends on how much you produce. Over time, we learn and then accumulating knowledge raises our living standard. We call this productivity growth. Those who are inventive and hardworking raises their productivity and their living standard faster than those who are complacent and lazy. But that isn't necessarily true over the short run. Productivity matters most in the long run, but credit matters most in the short run. This is because productivity growth doesn't fluctuate much, so it's not a big driver of economic swings. That is because it allows us to consume more than we produce when we acquire it, and it forces us to consume less than we produce when we have to pay it back. That swings occur into big cycle.
Occur in two big cycles.
One takes about 5 to 8 years, and the other takes about 75 to 100 years. While most people feel the swings, they typically don't see them as cycles because they see them too up close, day by day, week by week. 이번에는 경제 원리로 돌아가 세 가지의 큰 요소를 통해서 우리의 경험과 어떻게 상호작용하는지를 살펴보겠습니다. In this chapter, we are going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experience.
Cycles because they see them too up close, day by day, week by week. In this chapter,
we are going to step back and look at these three big forces and how they interact to make up our experiences. 말씀드린 것처럼 선 주위의 변동은 혁신 있는 노력의 크기 때문이 아니라 주로 얼마나 많은 신용이 있느냐에 좌우됩니다. As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is. As mentioned, swings along the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is. They are primarily due to how much credit there is.
Swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is.
As mentioned, swings around the line are not due to how much innovation or hard work there is.
They are primarily due to
how much credit there is. 신용이 없는 경제를 상상해 보겠습니다. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. Let's for a second imagine an economy without credit. 신용 없는 경제에서 지출을 늘릴 수 있는 유일한 방법은 소득을 늘리는 것인데 소득을 늘리려면 생산성이 더 늘어나거나 더 일을 해야죠. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and more work. In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and more work.
In this economy, the only way I can increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive.
And more work.
Imagine an economy without credit.
In this economy, the only way I increase my spending is to increase my income, which requires me to be more productive and more work. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. 성장의 유일한 방법은 생산성의 증가라는 겁니다. Increased productivity is the only way for growth. 나의 지출은 다른 사람의 소득이기 때문에 since my spending is another person's income, the economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive.
Since my spending is another person's income, The economy grows every time I or anyone else is more productive.
이렇게 행해지는 거래를 따라가면
Play this out. We see a progression like the product.
이렇게 행해지는 거래를 따라가면 우리는 생산성 증가 곡선을 보게 되죠. If we follow the transactions and play this out, we see a progression like the productivity growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. 하지만 우리가 돈을 빌리기 때문에 사이클이라는 것이 생깁니다. But because we borrow, we have cycles.
Activity growth line.
But because we borrow, we have cycles. 법이나 규제 때문이 아니라 인간의 본성과 신용이 작동하는 방식 때문이죠. This isn't due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works.
Isn't due to any laws or this out. We see a progression like the productivity
growth line. But because we borrow, we have cycles. This isn't due to any laws or regulation. It's due to human nature and the way the credit works. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. 대출을 미래에 돈을 당겨 쓰는 방법이라 생각해 보세요. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward. Pulling spending forward. Think of borrowing as simply a way of pulling spending forward.
In order to
buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. 어떤 것을 살 때 가진 돈이 부족하면 더 많은 돈이 필요하죠. In order to
do that, borrowing is simply a way of pulling spending forward. In
order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make.
Something you can't
due to human nature and the credit works. Think of borrowing simply a way pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. 그래서 당신은 미래의 자신에게서 돈을 당겨올 수밖에 없습니다. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, 당신의 미래의 시간을 가져오는 것이기에 미래에는 대출을 갚기 위해 버는 것보다 돈을 덜 써야 되죠. In doing so, you created a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. In doing so, you created a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back.
Future and to afford, you need to and the way the
credit works. Think of borrowing in simply a way pulling spending forward. In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make. To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you created a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. 그래서 사이클을 담게 됩니다. It very quickly resembles a cycle.
In order to buy something you can't afford, you need to spend more than you make.
To do this, you essentially need to borrow from your future self. In doing so, you can create a time in the future that you need to spend less than you make in order to pay it back. It very quickly resembles a cycle. 기본적으로 당신이 대출을 할 때마다 사이클이 생깁니다. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle.
Anytime you borrow, you create a cycle.
이것은 경제 전체에도 개인에게도 사실입니다. This is as true for an individual as it is for the economy. 그래서 신용에 대한 왜 중요한지가 설명됩니다. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into more mechanical, productive, or series of events that will happen in the future. 그래서 신용에 대한 왜 중요한지가 설명됩니다. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, productive, series of events that will happen in the future.
As it is for the back. It very quickly
resembles a cycle. Basically, anytime you borrow, you create a cycle. 이것은 사실이다. 개인적으로도 경제에게. This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. 그래서 신용에 대한 왜 중요한지가 설명됩니다.
This is why understanding credit is so important because it sets you create a cycle. This is as true for an
이것은
individual
사실 다
as it is for the
개인적으로
economy.
관계.
This is why
이것은 왜
understanding
이해한다
credit is so
신용이
important
중요하고
because it
왜냐하면
sets
그것은
into
모션이다
motion a
계획적인
mechanical,
predictable
predictable series
series
of
of
events
events
that
will
will
happen in the future. 미래에 무엇이 중요한지.
This makes credit
그래서 얻는 것입니다. 오케이. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with.
is what you settle transactions.
Money is what you settle transactions with. 당신이 현금으로 바텐더에게 맥주를 사면
with.
당신이 현금으로 바텐더에게 맥주를 사면 그 거래는 즉시 완료되는 것이다. When you buy a beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. 하지만 당신이 신용으로 맥주를 사게 되면 그것은 외상을 시작하는 것과 같은데 미래의 돈을 갚겠다고 약속하는 것이다. But when you buy a beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You are saying you promise to pay in the future.
When you buy a predictable series of events that
Events
will happen in the
that happen
future.
in the future. Okay.
This is why understanding credit is basically
anytime you borrow, you create a cycle.
This is as
이것은
true for an
사실이다
individual
개인적으로
as it is for
분별해도
the
is why
economy.
understanding credit.
This is why understanding
credit is so important because it sets into motion a mechanical, predictable series of events that will happen in the future. This makes credit different from money. Money is what you settle transactions with. When you buy your beer from a bartender with cash, the transaction is settled immediately. But when you buy your beer with credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You are saying you promise to pay in the future. 당신은 부채를 만들고 바텐더는 자산을 만든다. Together you and the bartender create an asset and a liability.
Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability.
Together you and the bartender create an asset and a liability.
With credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying
You promise to pay in the future.
Together,
you and the bartender create an asset and a
liability.
liability.
Credit, it's like starting
Liability.
a bar tab. You're saying
You promise to pay in the future.
Together,
you
you
and the bartender create an asset and a
liability. You just created starting a bar tab. You're saying
You
promise to
credit
pay
for
in
the
the future.
future. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. You just create credit out of thin air. 당신은 남대없이 신용을 창조한 거다. You just created credit out of thin air. You just created credit out of thin air.
Promise to pay in the future.
Pay in the future.
Together,
you and the bartender created an asset. You and the liability. You just created a credit out of thin air.
You promise to pay in the future.
Together you and the bartender. Together you and the bartender create an asset and a liability.
Promise in the future.
Together you and the bartender create an asset. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability.
With credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future.
Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability.
You just create like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability. With credit, it's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future. Together, you and the bartender create an asset and a liability. It's like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future.
Together you and the bartender you create an asset and a liability.
You just create like starting a bar tab. You're saying you promise to pay in the future.
Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender you created an asset and a liability. 당신은 부채를 만들고 바텐더는 자산을 만든다. Together you and the bartender 당신은 부채를 만들고 바텐더는 자산을 만들게 합니다. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. Created an asset and a liability. Together and a bartender together you and the bartender together you and the bartender and together you and the bartender an asset and a liability. Created an asset and a liability. Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. 당신은 부채를 만들고 바텐더는 자산을 만들게 됩니다. Asset Together you and the bartender created an asset and a liability. You just created credit out of thin air. You just created credit out of thin air. It's not until paid the barter later that the asset and the liability disappear.
Goes away and the transaction is settled.
The reality is that most of what people call money is actually credit. The total amount of credit in the United States is about $50 trillion, and the total amount of money is only about $3 trillion. Remember, in an economy without credit, the only way to increase your spending is to produce more. But in an economy with credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing.
With credit, you can also increase your spending by borrowing. As a result,
An economy with credit has more spending and allows incomes to rise faster than projected over the short run, but not over the long run. Now, don't get me wrong. Credit isn't necessarily something bad that just causes cycles.
Something bad that just causes cycles.
It's bad
when
if
it
finances
finances
overconsumption that can't be paid back.
However,
However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt.
For example, consumption that can't be paid back.
However, it's good when it efficiently allocates resources and produces income so you can pay back the debt. For example, if you borrow money to buy a big TV, if it doesn't generate income for you to pay back the debt. But if you're borrowing money to buy a tractor, say buy a tractor, and the tractor lets you harvest more crops and earn more money, then you can pay back your debt and improve your living standards. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit grow. In an economy with credit, we can follow the transactions and see how credit grows. Let me give you an example. Suppose you earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow.
Earn $100,000 a year and have no debt. You are creditworthy enough to borrow $10,000.
$10,000. Say on a credit card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you only earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000. So he can spend $121,000 even though he has only earned $110,000. His spending is another person's income. And by following the transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles. And if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first process of the short-term debt cycle. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the increases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air.
Say on a credit
card. So you can spend $110,000 even though you earn $100,000. Since your spending is another person's income, someone is earning $110,000. The person earning $110,000 with no debt can borrow $11,000, so you can spend $121,000, even though you only earn $110,000. His spending is another person's income, $101,000. Even though he's only $110,000, his spending is another person's income. His spending is another person's income. Transactions, we can begin to see how this process works in a self-reinforcing pattern. But remember, borrowing creates cycles, and if the cycle goes up, it eventually needs to come down. This leads us into the short-term debt cycle. As economic activity increases, we see an expansion, the first phase of the short-term debt cycles. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. Spending continues to increase and prices start to rise. This happens because the decreases in spending is fueled by credit, which can be created instantly out of thin air. When the amount of spending in incomes grow faster than the production of goods, prices rise. When prices rise, we call this inflation. When prices rise, We call this inflation. The central bank doesn't want too much inflation because it causes problems. Seeing prices rise, it raises interest rates. With higher interest rates, fewer people can afford to borrow money.
Fewer people can afford to borrow money.
And the cost of existing debt rises. Think about this as the monthly payments on your credit card going up. Because people borrow less and having higher debt payments, they have less money left over to spend, so spending slows.
People borrow less and have higher debt repayments, they have less money left over to spend, so spending slows.
And since one person's spending is another person's income, incomes dropped, and so on and so forth. When people spend less, prices go down. We call this deflation. Economic activity decreases and we have a recession. If the recession becomes too severe, inflation is no longer a problem. The central bank will lower interest rates to cause everything to pick up again. With lower interest rates, debt repayments are reduced and borrowing and spending pick up. And we see another expansion. As you can see, the economy works like a machine. In the short term, debt cycle spending is constrained only by the willingness of lenders and borrowers to provide and receive credit. When credit is easily available, there is an economic expansion. When credit is easily available, there is a recession. And note that this cycle is controlled primarily by the central bank. The short-term debt cycle typically lasts 5 to 8 years and happens over and over again for decades. But notice that the bottom and top of each cycle finish with more growth in the previous cycle and with more debt. Why? Because people push it. They have an inclination to borrow and spend more instead of paying back debt. It's human nature. Because of this, over long periods of time, debt rises faster than incomes, creating the long-term debt cycle.